They say that time heals all wounds, that the sharp edges of grief eventually dull into a manageable ache. They tell you to move on, to let go, and to find peace in the silence of the past. But they don't tell you what to do when the person who carved those wounds into your soul is thriving in the light of day. My name is Ria, and for a decade I was a ghost in a world that had forgotten my family's name. I watched from the shadows as the man who dismantled my father's life brick by brick built a cathedral for his own ego. I watched as he was celebrated, rewarded, and admired, all while my mother's eyes grew hollow and my brother's spirit dissolved into a bottle. Dominic Sterling didn't just ruin our business, he stole our future and turned our name into a punchline. He thought he was untouchable because he had played the game by the rules he wrote, but he forgot that the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun or a blade. It is a woman with a memory and a plan. Welcome to Echoes of Trust and Betrayal, where we peel back the polished layers of high society lies to find the rot beneath. This is not a story of a woman who fell in love. It is the story of a woman who weaponized love to secure a confession. Today, we are exploring the darkest corners of revenge, the kind that takes years to cultivate, the kind that requires you to kiss the hand that struck you until you can find the vein. Before we walk into that chapel of white roses and borrowed smiles, I need to ask you something. How far would you go for justice? Would you be willing to share a bed with a monster if it meant you could eventually put him in a cage? Would you lose yourself in a lie just to find the truth? I want to see your resolve. Go to the comments right now, pause the video and type "Justice is patient" or "Never forget." Tell me where you're joining us from, whether you are in Nigeria, the United Kingdom, South Africa, or Canada. We are a global family of truth seekers, and tonight we are going to watch a titan fall. Take a deep breath. The ceremony is about to begin. Let's dive in. I married him in a chapel full of white roses and borrowed smiles. An environment so perfectly curated that it felt like a film set designed to hide a crime. The scent of the lilies was thick, cloying, almost suffocating, like a perfumed veil meant to mask the smell of old blood and broken dreams. Everyone said I looked radiant. They complimented the ethereal glow of my skin and the way the vintage silk of my gown seemed to capture the sunlight. They saw a beautiful bride reaching the summit of a social mountain. They didn't notice that my hands were trembling, not from the nervous joy they all whispered about, but from the raw, vibrating energy of a decade-old memory. I stood at that altar looking at Dominic Sterling, and for a split second, the chapel disappeared, replaced by the cold, sterile light of the courtroom where he had stood 10 years ago and lied through his perfect teeth. As he slid the heavy platinum band onto my finger, his thumb brushed against my skin with a terrifying familiarity. It was the same careless confidence, the same effortless certainty that he always won, that had defined every interaction he'd ever had with my family. He leaned in, his breath warm against my ear, smelling of expensive champagne and victory, and whispered a single word: "Finally." He thought this was the ending of his conquest. He thought he had finally claimed the one thing he felt he deserved: a beautiful, mysterious woman who looked at him with the admiration he craved. He didn't realize that Ria was a mask I had spent years carving. He didn't realize that beneath the silk and the lace, I was the daughter of Elias Monroe, the man he had murdered with a pen and a press release. To Dominic, this wedding was a trophy ceremony. To me, it was the start of an interrogation. Dominic Sterling was a man the world loved to admire. He was the quintessential self-made titan, a man with a spotless reputation and a smile that seemed to open doors before he even reached them. In public, he was a philanthropist, a visionary, a partner you could trust with your life. But I knew the Dominic that lived in the margins of the ledgers. I knew the man who saw my father's honesty not as a virtue, but as a weakness to be exploited. Dominic didn't pull a trigger. He was far more sophisticated than that. He destroyed my family legally, using the very system my father believed in to crush him. He had planted the evidence, groomed the auditors, and performed the role of the betrayed partner so convincingly that the world turned its back on the Monroes overnight. My father died of a heart attack, but in my heart, I knew the truth. Dominic Sterling had squeezed the life out of him until his heart simply had no reason to beat. As we walked back down the aisle, the guests cheering and tossing petals, I felt a strange, cold sense of peace. The happiest day of my life was a farce, but it was a necessary one. I looked at the faces in the crowd, the powerful, the wealthy, the complicit, and I realized that none of them saw me. They saw the new Mrs. Sterling, a beautiful accessory to a powerful man. I squeezed Dominic's hand, playing the part of the devoted wife, and felt the cold metal of my wedding ring. It wasn't a symbol of love. It was a shackle I had voluntarily put on so that I could stay close enough to feel his pulse. Dominic thought he had won the long game. He thought the past was buried under settlements and non-disclosure agreements. But as the doors of the chapel opened to the cheering world outside, I looked at the horizon and made a silent vow to my father. He thinks he's bringing me home. I thought I'm bringing him to justice. To understand the woman standing in that chapel, you have to understand the man who necessitated my transformation. Dominic Sterling didn't just walk into our lives. He wove himself into the very fabric of our family like a parasite, disguised as a guardian. Growing up, I remember him as the man whose laughter filled our living room during Sunday brunches, the business partner my father trusted more than his own shadow. They were a team, Elias Monroe, the dreamer with the technical soul, and Dominic Sterling, the charismatic engine who could sell a vision to the blind. They built their company from a dusty garage into a skyscraper empire. I remember my father coming home with ink on his shirts and a light in his eyes, telling us that they were building a legacy. He believed in the handshake. He believed that loyalty was a currency more valuable than any dividend. He never realized that to a man like Dominic, loyalty is just a vulnerability to be leveraged when the price is right. Dominic Sterling was the master of the clean crime. He understood early on that if you want to destroy a man, you don't take his life, you take his name. A dead man can be a martyr, but a disgraced man is a ghost that no one wants to see. In private, Dominic was a predator who studied the architecture of my father's honesty. He knew that my father kept meticulous records, but he also knew that my father trusted him with the digital keys to the kingdom. While we were celebrating holidays together, Dominic was already drafting the blueprints for our execution. He didn't just steal the money, he made it look like my father had stolen it from him. The fall didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, agonizing tightening of the noose that lasted for months. First came the internal discrepancy, then the third-party audit. I remember the night the authorities knocked on our door. My father, still in his slippers, looked at them with the confusion so pure it should have been its own defense. Dominic was there that night too. He stood on our lawn with a look of devastated shock, his hand on my mother's shoulder, telling her he would do everything in his power to help. But when the cameras arrived the next morning, his tone shifted. He stood in front of a bank of microphones and spoke of his deep disappointment in a partner he had loved like a brother. He let the world see his pain, making my father's supposed betrayal look like a personal tragedy for Dominic. He wasn't just the accuser, he was the victim, and the world swallowed the lie whole.
By the time the trial began, the Dominic I knew was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical titan of industry who spoke in facts and figures that didn't exist. He had hired the best lawyers money could buy, while my father had to sell his pride just to afford a defense. I watched my father age 20 years in those months. His hair went white, his posture collapsed, and the light in his eyes, the light that had built an empire, flickered out. Dominic had stolen his reputation, his wealth, and his dignity. But what I couldn't forgive, what I carried with me into that chapel 10 years later, was the way Dominic looked at us in the courtroom. He didn't look at us with guilt. He looked at us with a terrifying blank indifference. To him, we weren't people. We were just the collateral damage of his expansion. He had destroyed us legally, cleanly, and without a single drop of blood on his hands. Or so he thought. He didn't realize that a ghost has nothing left to lose, and a ghost is the only thing that can follow you into the dark.
The conviction was the final hammer blow, but it was the silence that followed that truly killed my father. When the judge read the verdict, guilty on all counts of embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny, the courtroom didn't erupt in chaos. It felt as if the air had been vacuumed out of the room, leaving us gasping in a space that no longer recognized our humanity. I remember looking at the back of my father's neck. He seemed so small in his worn suit, the fabric hanging off shoulders that had once carried the weight of an entire company. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. Dominic Sterling, however, did. He turned toward the gallery where we sat, and for a fleeting, jagged second, our eyes met. There was no remorse in his gaze. There was only the cold, flat satisfaction of a man who had successfully deleted a problem from his balance sheet. The trial had dragged on for 6 grueling months, a slow-motion car crash that stripped us of everything we owned. To pay for the high-priced defense that ultimately failed, my mother had to sell our family home, the place where my height was marked on the pantry door and where my father's dreams had first taken flight. We moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment that smelled of old dust and broken spirits. My father was sentenced to 10 years, but he didn't even make it through the first. The prison system isn't designed for men like Elias Monroe, men who believe in the sanctity of their word. Within 3 months, his heart, already strained by the wake of a betrayal he couldn't wrap his mind around, simply gave up. The doctors called it a myocardial infarction brought on by extreme stress. I called it a successful execution. I remember the day we got the call. It was raining, a cliché perhaps, but the sky felt as heavy as my mother's heart. She didn't scream when she heard the news. She just sat down on the kitchen floor, surrounded by half-packed boxes, and stared at the wall. My brother, who had been a star athlete with a scholarship waiting for him, walked out of the apartment that night and didn't come back for 3 days. When he did return, he smelled of cheap whiskey and a new, terrifying kind of numbness. Dominic had taken my father's life, but he had also stolen my brother's future and my mother's light. Our name, once synonymous with integrity in the industry, became a toxic word that people avoided at cocktail parties. We were the Monroe frauds, the cautionary tale used by parents to warn their children about the dangers of greed. At the funeral, there were no crowds. No business partners came to pay their respects to the man who had helped build their fortunes. The only flowers were from a few distant relatives who looked at us with a mixture of pity and suspicion. I stood by the grave, my hand gripping my mother's thin arm, and I felt something inside me shift. The grief didn't go away, but it transformed. It hardened into a cold, diamond-sharp purpose. I looked at the fresh earth and made a silent promise to the man beneath it. I wouldn't just clear his name. I would destroy the man who turned him into a headline. I realized then that justice is not something that is given to you by a judge or a jury. It is something you have to take with your own hands.
Dominic Sterling thought he had buried the last of the Monroes that day. He didn't realize he had just planted the seeds of his own destruction.
The years that followed my father's death were not lived, they were survived. There is a specific kind of poverty that comes after wealth, a loud, echoing emptiness that makes every meal taste like shame. Dominic Sterling didn't just take our money, he took our safety, our identity, and our peace of mind. While he was rebranding the company as Sterling Global, removing my father's name from the lobby walls and the letterheads, my mother was selling her engagement ring to a pawnbroker just to keep the lights on in our cramped apartment. I watched her hands, once soft and manicured, grow cracked and red from the cleaning job she took under a different name. She aged 20 years in 5, her vibrant spirit replaced by a haunting, hollow stare that never quite left her face. She became a woman who apologized for existing, a ghost haunting the wreckage of her own life. Then there was my brother, Leo. Before the trial, Leo was the golden boy, a scholarship athlete with a laugh that could fill a stadium. But when Dominic turned our name into poison, Leo's world collapsed. His scholarship was reviewed and revoked. His friends, the ones who had cheered for him on the field, stopped answering his text. He didn't have the cold, calculating fury that was beginning to grow in me. He only had pain. I watched him drown that pain in bottles he never put down, his athlete's frame wasting away until he was a shadow of the brother I knew. He became a man of silences and sudden, violent outbursts of grief. Every time I looked at him, I didn't see a failure. I saw another victim of Dominic's clean crime. Dominic hadn't just stolen our bank accounts, he had stolen Leo's future and replaced it with a slow-motion tragedy. I was the only one who stayed sharp. While my mother prayed and my brother drank, I studied. I studied the law, I studied forensic accounting, and most importantly, I studied Dominic. I kept a scrapbook hidden under my mattress, not of memories, but of news clippings. I followed every acquisition he made, every gala he attended, every charitable donation he used to polish his blood-stained reputation. I watched him expand into the tech sector, becoming an untouchable titan of industry. I watched him get married to a socialite, then divorced 2 years later with a settlement that could have fed my family for generations. Every time I saw his face on a magazine cover, I didn't feel anger. I felt a cold, clinical curiosity. I was learning the architecture of his ego, finding the cracks in the foundation he thought was impenetrable. We were living in a world that had moved on, but I was a clock that had stopped at the moment of the verdict. Our name was a ghost story, a cautionary tale told in the back rooms of investment firms. Don't end up like the Monroes, they would say. But as I sat in the library for hours, working 2 jobs and going to school at night, I realized that our poisoned name was actually my greatest advantage. No one was looking for a Monroe anymore. We were dead and buried, and in that invisibility, I found my power. I changed my legal name to Rhea Vance, using my mother's maiden name, and I cut my hair, changed my style, and learned how to speak the language of the people who had shunned us. I was preparing to enter Dominic's world, not as a victim seeking an apology, but as a predator who had spent a decade learning the scent of her prey. Dominic Sterling had taken everything from us, but in doing so, he had left me with nothing to lose. And a woman with nothing to lose is the most dangerous thing he would ever encounter. The encounter happened at a charity gala for the Sterling Foundation, the irony of which felt like a physical weight in my chest. I had spent 6 months meticulously positioning myself, working my way into a mid-tier public relations firm that specialized in high society events. I knew his schedule better than he did. I knew which fundraisers he attended to maintain his saintly image,
and which bars he frequented when he wanted to disappear. That night, I was just a face in a sea of expensive silk and borrowed diamonds. I had changed my hair to a sharp, dark bob, and my name, Rhea Vance, was now a legitimate identity with a curated digital trail. I had learned how to smile without revealing my teeth, how to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, and how to look at powerful men with just enough curiosity to make them feel like the center of the universe. I was standing near the terrace, looking out at the city lights, when I felt the shift in the air that always preceded his arrival. It was a gravitational pull, a parasitic energy that drew eyes toward him. Dominic Sterling walked into the room like he owned the oxygen we were breathing. He looked exactly the same, perhaps a bit more silver at the temples, a bit more polish on the shoes, but the eyes were unchanged. They were the eyes of a man who saw everything as a transaction. I didn't turn around immediately. I waited until he was close enough to smell his signature scent, sandalwood and expensive scotch. I waited until I could feel the heat of his presence. When I finally turned, I made sure my expression was one of mild, polite surprise. "I feel like I know you," he said. It was his standard opening, a line he used to disarm women by making them feel already familiar. He didn't recognize me. Why would he? To him, Rhea Monroe was a teenage girl in a cheap funeral dress, a piece of trash he had swept off his porch a decade ago. He was looking at a woman in a deep emerald gown who looked like she belonged in his world. I held his gaze for a second longer than was polite, letting the silence stretch until it became intimate. I felt a surge of nausea so violent I thought I might actually collapse, but I forced it down into the dark basement of my soul. I smiled, a soft, practiced curve of the lips that didn't reach my eyes. "I probably do," I said, my voice smooth and steady. "I've been told I have one of those faces." He chuckled, a deep, resonant sound that once would have made me feel safe, but now made my skin crawl. He stayed by my side for the rest of the night. I watched him work the room, fascinated by the ease with which he lied, the way he could pivot from talking about philanthropy to market dominance without skipping a beat. He was a master of the mask, but I was becoming his most dedicated student. I let him flirt effortlessly, playing the role of the intrigued but slightly guarded professional. I didn't give him everything at once. I knew men like Dominic were bored by easy conquests. I made him work for my attention, leading him into a dance where he thought he was the one in control. That night, after he had personally escorted me to my car and handed me a card with a private number, I went home and threw up until my ribs ached. I sat on the cold floor of my bathroom, shaking, the ghost of his touch on my arm feeling like a burn. But even as the bile burned my throat, a terrifying clarity took hold of me. He had taken the bait. He didn't see the daughter of the man he killed. He saw a new toy. He thought he was the predator choosing his next meal, but he hadn't noticed that the cage door had already started to close. I wasn't just Rhea Vance anymore. I was the architect of his ending. I looked at the card in my hand, his name embossed in gold, and I knew that the long game had truly begun.
Revenge, I discovered, is not a sudden explosion. It is a slow-growing vine that eventually chokes the life out of everything it touches. To destroy a man like Dominic Sterling, I couldn't just throw a stone at his window. I had to become the very air he breathed. I let him court me with the calculated patience of a diamond cutter. For 18 months, I played the part of the perfect companion. I was the woman who understood his late-night ambitions, the woman who laughed at his stories of market conquest, and the woman who made him feel like the titan he believed himself to be.
I watched him carefully, documenting the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about power and the way his jaw tightened when he felt even a glimmer of disrespect. Men like Dominic have a fatal flaw. They talk too much when they feel admired. Because he viewed me as a beautiful ornament, an intellectual inferior he had successfully won, he began to let his guard down. He thought he was teaching me the ways of the world, but in reality, I was conducting a master class in his downfall. During our long dinners at dimly lit corner tables, I learned his habits, the way he used 3 different phones for 3 different lives, the way he preferred handshake deals that left no paper trail, and the specific offshore accounts he mentioned only when he'd had a 3rd glass of vintage scotch. I wasn't just his girlfriend. I was a silent auditor, cataloging every skeleton he had buried in the foundation of his empire. I learned the names of the shell companies he had used to bury my father, names like Vance Sterling Holdings and EM Logistics. Seeing those initials on his private documents sent a surge of ice through my veins, but I never let my mask slip. I practiced my reactions in the mirror every night until my face was a fortress of lies. I learned where the unrecoverable documents were stored, the encrypted drives he kept in a safe behind a fake Degas in his study. I learned which politicians were on his payroll and which auditors looked the other way for a percentage of the spoils. I was building a map of his crimes, one whispered secret at a time, waiting for the moment when the terrain was perfectly in my favor. And then, on a rainy Tuesday evening that felt remarkably like the day of my father's funeral, he proposed. We were in his penthouse, the city lights reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling glass like a sea of cold diamonds. He dropped to one knee, holding a ring that cost more than my mother's life was currently worth. He looked at me with a terrifyingly sincere version of love, a love that was really just the ultimate form of possession. I looked at the diamond, then at the man who had murdered my family with a smile, and I said yes. I said yes because I knew that the safest place to destroy a man like Dominic Sterling was from the inside. I wasn't entering a marriage, I was infiltrating the enemy's headquarters. I let him slide the ring onto my finger, feeling its weight like a shackle, and I realized that the long game was finally coming to its climax.
Being married to Dominic Sterling was like living inside a beautifully furnished mausoleum. To the outside world, we were the ultimate power couple, the brilliant Titan and his elegant, mysterious wife. Our home was a sprawling estate of cold marble and high-tech security, a place where every surface was polished and every conversation was a performance. Dominic controlled everything, the accounts, the social schedule, the very narrative of our lives. He loved the idea of me, the way I looked on his arm at galas, the way I curated his image, but he never truly saw me. He underestimated the quiet woman who brought him his coffee and listened to his rants about inefficient competitors. He thought he had tamed a wildfire, but he had actually invited the arsonist into his bedroom. At night, when the house fell into a heavy, expensive silence and Dominic was lost in the deep sleep of the arrogant, I became a ghost. I spent hours in his study, my heartbeat thundering in my ears as I bypassed the security codes I had spent months memorizing. I photographed ledgers, copied encrypted files onto hidden drives, and tracked the movement of funds through shell companies that spanned 3 continents. I found the original contracts, the ones my father had signed in good faith, and the forged addendums Dominic had used to frame him. I was rebuilding my family's case piece by piece, document by document, turning his own meticulous records into the evidence that would hang him. I made quiet, untraceable phone calls from a burner phone I kept hidden in a hollowed-out book. I met with the few people who still remembered Elias Monroe, the retired bookkeeper who had been too afraid to testify, the former assistant who had seen the errors but was paid to stay silent. I gave them a reason to be brave. I gave them the proof they needed to know they weren't alone. I was weaving a web that extended far beyond the walls of our estate, connecting the dots that Dominic that he had successfully erased a decade ago. Every day I spent as Mrs. Sterling was a day I spent dismantling the man who gave me the name. The psychological toll was immense. Every time he kissed me, I felt the ghost of my father's last breath. Every time he told me he loved me, I heard the sound of the judge's gavel. I had to inhabit a lie so deeply that I sometimes forgot where Rhea Vance ended and Rhea Monroe began. But then I would look at the photo of my father I kept hidden in my locket, and the cold, diamond-hard purpose would return. I wasn't just a wife. I was a soldier behind enemy lines. I was waiting for the perfect moment, the one day where his guard would be at its lowest and his pride at its highest. I was waiting for our anniversary. Our first anniversary arrived with the kind of oppressive atmospheric gloom that usually precedes a cataclysm. Dominic, ever the lover of grand gestures, had arranged for a private dinner in the solarium of our estate, a glass cathedral that overlooked the manicured gardens he had bought with my family's blood. He was in an exceptionally triumphant mood that evening. He had just closed a deal that would double his net worth, and he paced the room with the restless, predatory energy of a man who believed the world was his personal plaything. He talked for nearly an hour about his vision, about how he had outmaneuvered his latest rivals, and how he and I were the new founding blood of a global dynasty. He looked at me with a terrifying, possessive pride, convinced that he had successfully molded me into the perfect reflection of his own vanity. "I have a gift for you, Dominic," I said, my voice cutting through his monologue with a cold, ringing clarity that finally made him stop pacing. He smiled, expecting perhaps a watch or a piece of art to add to his collection. I reached into my bag and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound journal. It looked like an heirloom, something solid and timeless. "It's a history," I whispered, as I slid it across the table toward him. He chuckled, pouring himself another glass of vintage scotch before opening the cover. "A history of us?" he asked, his tone dripping with a patronizing warmth. I didn't answer. I just watched his eyes as they landed on the first page. His smile didn't fade all at once. It withered, like a leaf caught in a sudden frost. The first page wasn't a photo of our wedding. It was a high-resolution scan of a wire transfer from 10 years ago, the one he had used to move money into my father's secret slush fund. He flipped the page, his movements growing frantic. Transcripts of emails he thought had been purged from the servers, bank records from offshore accounts he believed were untraceable, photographs of the original, unforged contracts that bore my father's real signature. As he reached the center of the book, his face didn't just go pale, it turned a sickly, ashen gray. The silence in the solarium became so heavy I could hear the rhythmic thud of the blood in my own temples. "What is this, Rhea?" he whispered, his voice cracking, a sound he had never heard him make before. It was the sound of a man who had finally found something he couldn't buy his way out of. "What is this sick joke?" He tried to laugh, but it was a hollow, rattling sound. He looked at me, searching for the Rhea Vance he thought he had mastered, but she was gone.
Standing before him was the ghost of every lie he had ever told. I leaned forward, the candlelight dancing in my eyes like a wildfire. "This isn't a joke, Dominic," I said, my voice a low, lethal hum. "This is a record of exactly what you did to Elias Monroe. This is the paper trail of the murder you committed without a weapon." He slammed the book shut, his eyes darting toward the exits, his mind already racing to find a defense, a lie, a way to bury me. But he underestimated the depth of his own arrogance. He believed that even now, even with the proof in front of him, he was still the most powerful person in the room. He believed that I was still his, and that he could manipulate me into silence. He stood up, towering over me, trying to use his physical presence to reclaim control. "You think anyone will believe you?" he spat, his voice regaining its venom. "You're a ghost, Rhea. You're a nobody with a collection of fairy tales. My father was a loser who couldn't handle the pressure, and you're just a bitter little girl playing dress-up." I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I did the one thing he never expected. I pulled a small, high-fidelity digital recorder from the pocket of my silk robe and placed it on the table between us. I pressed record, the tiny red light blinking like a warning beacon. "Then tell me, Dominic," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "If it's all a fairy tale, tell me why you did it. Tell me how you framed a man who loved you like a brother just because he was in the way of your expansion. Tell me why you were so afraid of him." I saw the muscles in his jaw twitch. I saw the pride flare in his eyes, the fatal, terminal pride of a man who can't bear to be thought of as anything less than a genius. He leaned down until he was inches from me, his shadow swallowing me whole. And then he began to speak. Dominic talked because men like him believe their own myths. He talked because in his twisted reality, his crimes weren't sins. They were strokes of brilliance that the average mind simply couldn't comprehend. He leaned into the microphone of the recorder as if he were addressing a board of directors, his voice dropping into that smooth, predatory cadence he used when he was closing a deal. He didn't deny it. Instead, he justified it. He explained, with a chilling lack of emotion, how my father's obsolete morality had become a roadblock to the company's inevitable evolution. He spoke of my father as if he were a piece of faulty machinery that needed to be replaced, rather than a human being who had shared his home and his heart. "Elias was a good man, Rhea, I'll give you that," Dominic said, his eyes glittering with a dark, manic energy. "But good men are static. They don't build empires. They don't see the world for what it is, a series of levers and pulleys. He was standing on a lever I needed to pull." He began to pace the solarium, his shadow stretching across the floor like a stain. He detailed the mechanics of the frame-up with a pride that made my skin turn to ice. He described the elegance of the digital trail he had created, the way he had manipulated the auditors' egos, and how easy it had been to lead the FBI exactly where they wanted them to go. He laughed, a dry, rattling sound as he recalled my father's face during the sentencing. "He looked so confused," Dominic whispered, almost to himself. "He lived his whole life believing the truth was enough. He never realized that the truth is just a story told by the person who's still standing." As he spoke, the storm that had been brewing outside finally broke. Thunder shook the glass walls of the solarium, and rain began to lash against the panes with a violent, rhythmic intensity. Dominic didn't notice. He was intoxicated by his own confession, by the relief of finally showing someone the genius behind his success. He admitted to the offshore accounts, the forged signatures, and the quiet payments to the prison officials to ensure my father's stress was managed in a specific way. He laid out the entire architecture of our family's ruin as if he were presenting a trophy. He thought he was explaining his greatness to a woman who belonged to him. He didn't realize he was reading his own obituary. The moment he finished, the air in the room seemed to change. The manic light in his eyes flickered and died as he looked at my face. Not the face of a submissive wife, but the face of a judge. I didn't say a word. I simply picked up my phone, which had been live streaming the entire conversation to a secure server, and pressed end. At that exact second, the heavy oak doors of the solarium didn't just open, they were breached. The silence of the estate was shattered by the sound of heavy boots on marble and the sharp, authoritative commands of federal agents. The collapse was instantaneous. I watched the blood drain from Dominic's face as he realized that the secure perimeter of his life had been a lie. He looked at the recorder, then at the men in tactical vests flooding the room, and then at me. For the first time in 10 years, the predator looked like prey. He tried to speak, to spin one last lie, to reclaim the narrative, but the words died in his throat. As they forced him against the very glass wall he had used to overlook his kingdom, the handcuffs clicking into place with a sound that echoed like a gavel, I stepped forward. I leaned into his ear, just as he had done at the altar, and whispered the only thing left to say. My name is Rhea Monroe, and the truth is now the only story being told.
The aftermath of a storm is always quieter than the wind that preceded it. As the tail lights of the federal vehicles faded down our long, gated driveway, the silence that rushed back into the estate was absolute. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of a lie. It was the clean, hollow silence of an empty house. I stood in the center of the solarium, surrounded by the remnants of our anniversary dinner, the vintage scotch, the cooling lobster, the leather-bound book of crimes. I looked at the glass wall where Dominic had been pressed just moments before. The smudge of his breath was still there, a fading ghost on the window, but the man himself was gone. He had been removed from his throne like a glitch in the system he thought he owned. Justice, I realized, doesn't always feel like a celebration. It feels like a long overdue debt being settled. Within hours, the news cycle caught the scent of the blood. Titan Dominic Sterling arrested on racketeering and fraud charges, the headlines screamed. But it was the second wave of news that truly mattered. Because of the evidence I had meticulously gathered, the original contracts, the recordings, the testimony of the silenced, the federal investigators didn't just look at Dominic's current dealings, they looked back. They reopened the files of Monroe Cross. They looked at the conviction of Elias Monroe with fresh, unbiased eyes, and under the harsh light of the truth, the frame-up disintegrated like wet paper. I called my mother that night. I didn't tell her about the arrest or the recording. I simply told her to turn on the news. I stayed on the line with her in silence as she watched the scrolling text at the bottom of the screen. When the anchor finally said the words, "New evidence suggests the late Elias Monroe was wrongfully convicted," I heard a sound from her that I will never forget. It wasn't a sob, it was a long, shuddering release of air, as if she had been holding her breath for 10 years. She didn't have to be a ghost anymore. She didn't have to apologize for her name. In that moment, the weight that had aged her 20 years was lifted, and though it couldn't bring my father back, it gave her back her dignity. My brother, Leo, was harder to reach. He was in a facility,
3 weeks into a sobriety he hadn't asked for, but I had insisted on. When I visited him and showed him the news, he didn't cheer. He just sat there, looking at the photos of our father being vindicated, and his hands, usually so shaky, were finally still. The rage that had fueled his addiction had nothing left to burn. "He's clear, Leo," I whispered. My brother looked at me, and for the first time since the trial, I saw the golden boy again. The shadow was gone. We didn't need to be the Monroe frauds anymore. We were just the Monroes. As for the Sterling fortune, I didn't want a single cent of it. It was tainted by the lives it had cost. Through my lawyers, I ensured that the vast majority of the assets were liquidated and donated to legal defense funds, organizations dedicated to representing families like mine that had been crushed by the weight of corporate greed and legal manipulation. I kept only enough to move my mother into a house with a garden and to ensure Leo had the best care possible. Dominic thought I married him for his money. The final irony was that I used his money to ensure men like him would never be able to pull the same lever again. Justice isn't loud. It doesn't need to scream to be heard. It is the quiet, steady sound of a name being restored to its rightful place.
There is a strange, hollow period that follows the completion of a decade-long mission. For 10 years, my entire identity had been constructed around the destruction of Dominic Sterling. Every meal I ate, every book I read, every smile I practiced in the mirror was a brick in the wall I was building around him. Now that the wall had closed in and the prisoner was behind bars, I found myself standing in the center of a life that felt unfamiliar. The estate was sold, the Vance alias was retired, and the expensive emerald gowns were packed away in boxes destined for charity. I moved back to a small house near the coast, a place where the air smelled of salt and the only noise was the rhythmic pulse of the tide. It was here, in the quiet, that I had to face the most difficult question of all. Who was Rhea Monroe without her ghost? The legal battle that followed Dominic's arrest was a circus, but I watched it from a distance. He tried everything. He hired a new team of bulldog lawyers who attempted to paint me as a manipulative femme fatale, a woman who had seduced a grieving man only to frame him for her father's ancient sins. They called my evidence coerced and my recordings illegally obtained, but they were fighting a fire with a garden hose. The sheer volume of the data I had extracted from his safe, the ledgers, the shell company filings, the communications with corrupt officials, was too massive to be ignored. One by one, his allies turned on him. Men who had toasted to his health months ago were now cutting deals with the prosecution to save their own skins. Dominic Sterling wasn't just losing a case. He was watching his entire spotless empire be dismantled by the very people who had helped him build it. I visited him only once, not out of a need for closure. I had already closed the book, but because I wanted to see him without the mask. He was sitting behind a plexiglass partition, dressed in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that made him look remarkably ordinary. The silver at his temples was unkempt, and the titan of industry looked like what he had always been beneath the polish, a small man who had cheated his way to a large life. He didn't look at me with fury this time. He looked at me with a desperate, pathetic confusion. "Why?" he whispered into the phone receiver. "I actually loved you, Rhea. In my own way, I gave you everything." I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt absolutely nothing. No hate, no satisfaction, no pity. Just a vast, cooling indifference. "You didn't love me, Dominic," my voice steady and light.
You loved the mirror you thought I was. You loved the idea of someone finally being as clever as you. But you forgot one thing. My father didn't build a company because he was static. He built it because he believed in the people he worked with. You built a kingdom on a swamp of lies, and you're surprised that the ground gave way. I hung up the phone before he could respond. As I walked out of that prison, the sunlight felt different on my skin. It wasn't the harsh, exposing light of the trial. It was the warm, forgiving light of a new day. I realized then that the measure of truth isn't found in a courtroom or a headline. It's found in the quiet moments when you no longer have to look over your shoulder. I had spent a decade playing a game of shadows, and in the process, I had almost lost the girl who used to mark her height on the pantry door. But as I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sunset bleed into the ocean, I felt her coming back. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I wasn't a vigilante. I was a woman who had honored her family by refusing to let their story end in a lie. Dominic Sterling had tried to bury the Monroes, but he had only succeeded in proving that the truth is the only thing that can survive the dark.
The final closure didn't come with the news of Dominic's sentencing, though 25 years in a maximum security facility felt like a poetic justice for a man who had spent 40 years stealing time from others. The final closure came on a Tuesday, a day of no particular significance, when I received a small, battered box from the federal evidence locker. It was my father's personal effects from the day he was arrested, the things the world had deemed worthless when they were stripping him of his dignity. Inside was his cheap, scratched watch, a pair of reading glasses, and a small, leather-bound notebook. I opened the notebook to the last page he had written before the world collapsed. In his steady, elegant script, he had written, "The truth is a slow runner, but it never loses its breath." I sat in my house by the sea and realized that Dominic Sterling's greatest mistake wasn't the embezzlement, the forgeries, or the frame-up. His greatest mistake was his fundamental belief that people like my father, people who are good, are somehow easy to erase. He thought that because we were quiet, we were weak. He thought that because we played by the rules, we didn't know how to fight. He never understood that the most dangerous woman in the room isn't the one screaming for attention or the one making threats. It's the one who smiles, waits, and lets you become the architect of your own destruction. He gave me the blueprints, he gave me the materials, and he even gave me the key to the front door. All I had to do was wait for him to step inside and pull the lever. Dominic is gone now. His name is a footnote in a legal textbook, a cautionary tale of corporate psychopathy. The Sterling name has been scrubbed from the buildings, replaced with names that actually mean something to the communities they serve. My mother is safe, her garden is blooming, and my brother is learning how to live in a world where he doesn't have to hide. As for me, I still have the gold ring Dominic gave me. I keep it in a small glass jar on my mantle, not as a memento of a marriage, but as a trophy of a war. It is a reminder that even the most powerful titan can be brought down by a single, focused truth. I look in the mirror now, and I don't see the Rhea Vance who had to lie to survive. I see Rhea Monroe. My hair is growing out, the sharp bob replaced by the soft waves I used to have. The ice in my eyes has melted into a calm, steady light. I learned that revenge doesn't have to turn you into the monster you're fighting. You don't have to become a predator to catch one. You just have to be the truth. And the truth is the only thing that remains when the lights go out and the masks fall away. I didn't marry Dominic Sterling because I loved him. I married him because I remembered. Because some wounds don't fade. They wait for the perfect moment to be healed by justice. When he finally understood who I was, as the handcuffs tightened and the glass walls of his kingdom shattered around him, he realized too late that he had invited his own ending into his bed. The most dangerous woman in the room is the one who knows your secrets better than you do. She is the one who smiles, waits, and lets you destroy yourself. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the truth is worth the wait, or if it made your heart race for a woman who refused to be a victim, then you are exactly where you are meant to be. This is where justice finds its voice. This is where the ghost finally speaks. And this is Echoes of Trust and Betrayal. I want to hear from the survivors tonight. Go to the comments and type, "I am still standing." Tell me one thing you've reclaimed from your past. Let's build a community where the truth is never buried. Please like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to know that no matter how powerful the lie, the truth is coming. My name is Rhea, and I am finally beautifully home. Until next time, keep your eyes open, your heart guarded, and never forget who you are.